The cry of a newborn baby broke the tense silence in the room. Sweat dripped from the woman's forehead, her wet hair sticking to her cheeks. She sighed in relief and the expression of agony on her face changed to a smile. The doctor who delivered the baby cut the umbilical cord and took care of the little man who had just come into the world, while the nurse watched carefully the behavior of the woman who had just become a mother a few seconds ago. She was no longer young, but fortunately everything had gone well, her health was normal, but still, she could use a little extra caution. "Thank you, Linda." With tears of happiness in his eyes, the young man in the room who had been holding her hand the whole time said. She slowly nodded and smiled, accepting his words of gratitude. She had no strength for more. She could see his tears, but no one could see hers, they were lost on the woman's face among the large drops of sweat. She laughed muffledly, a smile frozen on her face, and she closed her eyes. At that moment a young man stood up and a screaming infant was handed into his arms. He took it gently and felt goosebumps run down his back. Kyle had just become a father. It was a miraculous moment. Everyone in the room gazed at the father and his newborn son, only momentarily forgetting about the woman. Recovering, the nurse turned to the side and gasped. The woman lay motionless with a frozen smile on her face, her eyes closed. At the same time on the other side of town, awakened by a cautious knock on the door, Julia got out of bed, threw on a robe, and slapping her slippers on the hardwood floor walked to the door. Without even looking through the peephole, she opened it. A huge bouquet of roses appeared before her eyes. The messenger who had delivered it could not even be seen because of the myriad of flowers. Julia exclaimed joyfully. There could be only one reason for such a gift. She had unexpectedly become a mom. It was going to be tomorrow, early, so Julia had slept at home instead of being with her husband when their child was born. There were a few missed calls from her husband and a short message on the phone. "It's on. Come on over. P.S. Hope the messenger woke you up, sleepyhead." And funny emoticons. Those funny faces in the message from her husband meant that the couple's lives were about to change dramatically, but to be honest, Julia didn't want that at all. It was her husband Kyle who wanted a baby, not her. Julia went to the bathroom, got some cold water and gently placed the roses in the water. She stopped and looked thoughtfully at the rose-filled bathroom. It was as if the flowers were breathing, feeding on the moisture, coming to life. What a beautiful sight. This was the end of her carefree life. Julia wiped her wet hands and went out into the living room, where she came across her and her husband's wedding photo. Looking at the happy newlyweds, Julia could hardly recognize herself and Kyle in them. It seemed like a long time ago, in some past life, not even a past life, but an other life. "It's time to move on," Julia said aloud, and, throwing on her spring coat, went outside to catch a cab to take her to the hospital. When they were still dating, Kyle had occasionally stuttered about wanting to be the head of a large family, but Julia had taken it more as a joke. And in the early years of their married life, Kyle and Julia had barely touched the subject of having children together. They knew they weren't ready to be parents yet. But Julia saw that her husband really wanted a child, because he was from a large family, he had an older sister and 2 younger brothers. He always spoke with warmth and joy about his childhood in a large and cheerful company, and even once said that he was truly sorry for children like Julia, who grew up alone. At that moment he hurt his wife's feelings, for she was indeed lonely, not only because she had no brothers and sisters, but also because she was raised by her mother, herself. Julia did not hold a grudge against her husband, but simply remembered their conversation and always gladly listened to funny stories from his childhood. They also often traveled to Kyle's sister's house and took gifts to their little nephew. Kyle loved to nurse the baby, even learning how to swaddle him. Julia found it interesting to watch him. How much tenderness and warmth there was in him. He's going to be a wonderful father, she thought to herself. Kyle's sister had been having trouble getting pregnant for a long time. In one of their conversations, Kyle shared that his sister and her husband had been trying to conceive for a long time with no results. They had gone to many doctors. And then one day, after years of trying, Kyle's sister announced that she was expecting a child. It was a great happiness for the whole family. Kyle was over the moon with happiness. It was then, looking at how her favorite person is happy, Julia gave herself the word that, despite her fears and concerns, will become a mother to his children. And after 3 years of marriage, Julia and Kyle together decided that it was time for them to become mom and dad. But in life it happens that those who do not plan to have children, everything turns out very easily, sometimes even by accident, and those who intentionally want to become parents, have to face difficulties. For 6 months Julia and Kyle tried to get pregnant, but nothing worked. Kyle communicated with his sister and found out about doctors she could recommend. So, after going to a specialist with a good reputation and having tests done, they learned that in their case a successful outcome was not guaranteed. They can keep trying and hoping, but only a miracle can help them conceive. There is a certain incompatibility, the doctor said at the time. Incompatibility. One single word. A terrible word that could destroy a family. Now, sitting on a bench at the playground and watching her 5-year-old son Jonathan ride on the swings, Julia realized that a real miracle had indeed happened in her life. No one expected such a twist of fate. It was still hard for Julia to believe that she was a mom, even at such a cost. At that moment the little boy jumped off the swing and, accelerating as fast as he could, ran up the children's slide. One day the day would come when she would have to tell him everything. Julia didn't want to think about it, so she stood up, so that she could see the slide better and not lose sight of her son, and waved to him. Jonathan waved back, and with a triumphant cry he went down the slide. He sat down on the white sand and laughed. A son's laughter is the sweetest music to a mother's ears. Yes, her Jonathan is a unique child, and one day he will find out that he is Julia's son and brother at the same time. Then, a few years ago, during a conversation with a doctor, the doctor said that in his opinion, the most suitable options for the young couple would be to adopt a child or to think about the services of a surrogate mother. Hearing the doctor's conclusion made Kyle want to scream in pain and despair. He had experienced what his sister had gone through, and now he was facing the same problem himself. Julia, on the other hand, was relieved. She caught herself thinking that she secretly wished things had turned out this way. She wouldn't have to go through the 9 months of waiting and agony that every mother goes through. She was afraid to share these red-hot thoughts with her husband. After the doctor's appointment, he looked very upset, even a little lost. Julia knew that he was unlikely to agree to adoption. Kyle wanted a child in whom he could recognize himself and his beloved wife. And surrogacy was too complicated. Where to find a healthy woman who could carry their child? This, firstly, and secondly, it is quite an expensive service and they simply cannot afford it. That's when, looking at her utterly broken husband, Julia realized that their family was in jeopardy. Incompatibility. How good they'd been before. But it would never be the same again. Incompatibility. That word pulsed through her head. Unfortunately, Julia's worst fears were realized, and soon her relationship with her husband began to deteriorate rapidly. In each other's presence, Kyle and Julia were tense. This tension turned into mutual irritation, which provoked constant quarrels. They stopped being affectionate toward each other. Their intimate life simply became non-existent. Eventually they moved to different apartments and decided to live temporarily apart. Their family was dying and neither he nor she knew how to save it. But then Julia's mother stepped in. Linda was a very strong and energetic woman. Life had taught her that she could only rely on herself. She did not complain about fate, but on the contrary tried in every possible way to take this villain into her own hands. And she succeeded. And although, like any living person, it happened that Linda cried lonely evenings, strangers could not think that she also has moments of weakness. Such a confident and strong woman she was in the eyes of others. She was in her 50s, but no one could give her more than 40, not only because she tried to look after her own health, but also because she felt young. Even with her daughter, Linda always acted like a sister and with her son-in-law like a good friend. Linda was not married, Julia's father had been divorced a long time ago, and despite the fact that the burden of responsibility for raising her daughter fell on her, she and her ex-husband maintained a good friendship. And although she never found a life partner, but did not feel lonely. She had many different interests. Many friends and countless acquaintances. She adored hiking and every year went camping in the mountains. Julia always wondered how her mother had so much energy. When Julia moved to her mother's house after a serious disagreement with her husband and they began to communicate, her daughter, although they had previously kept their problems secret from their relatives, told her mother everything. The mother listened attentively. The next morning, the daughter found her mother pacing around the room. Linda took big steps with her arms folded across her chest. The daughter remembered from her childhood that her mother was thinking about something very important. Seeing Julia, Linda sat her daughter down at the table and offered to be a surrogate mother for her and her son-in-law. She said she understood the responsibility. She understands the risks. She said she was doing it not only for her daughter and son-in-law, but also for herself. She had always wanted another child, but hadn't met someone with whom she wanted to share the joy of being parents again, and now she would love to experience those feelings again. The suggestion threw Julia off balance. She didn't know how to react, her feelings were mixed. It was hard to imagine her child being carried by her own mother, but on the other hand, she couldn't trust any woman on earth as much as her mother, and if she really wanted it, why not? That left Kyle to tell. Although he was on great terms with his mother-in-law, Julia wasn't entirely sure that her husband would respond favorably to such a suggestion. To her surprise, however, Kyle had taken the news enthusiastically and, unable to find the right words, had tried to thank his mother-in-law by calling her on the phone. It remained to be seen whether Linda could physically become a surrogate mother. The tests showed that with artificial insemination and appropriate supervision she would be able to bear and give birth. Within a year, she was walking around with her daughter and son-in-law's baby under her heart, and after another 9 months, she brought her daughter's son into the world. He was named Jonathan, a God-given name, because there could be no other name for a child thus born. After Jonathan's birth, Julia and Kyle were over the moon. They thanked fate for this incredible gift and for the opportunity to become parents. Deep down, however, Julia felt a constant sense of guilt toward her mother. It was hard for her to look at the wrinkles on Linda's face and think about the fact that she had sacrificed her health for their happiness. Julia tried her best to take care of her mother in gratitude. But when Linda died, Julia couldn't get over it for a long time. She wondered, would she have lived many more years if she hadn't gotten pregnant at her age? Kyle also took Linda's death hard. But then he remembered her smile at the sight of little Jonathan, and he realized she hadn't regretted her decision for a minute. Kyle was very grateful to his mother-in-law and made a promise to himself to cherish her memory forever. As Jonathan grew up, Julia and Kyle were afraid that their son might learn the truth about his birth from someone else. They wanted to tell him themselves when the time was right. Kyle was gnawing with guilt for not being able to support Julia and save their marriage. And Julia sometimes wondered if the two of them would have been happy without the children. If Jonathan hadn't been born, their relationship would have fallen apart. But Kyle had been her rock after everything that had happened. Now, watching her flesh and blood son play in the sandbox, Julia kept thinking, against her will, that the day would come when they would tell her son about how and thanks to whom he'd come into this world. For now, they are just walking in the park, they are happy here and now, any minute now Kyle's dad should be coming to pick them up and they will all go to visit his grandmother together. When Kyle pulled up to the playground and got out of the car, Jonathan saw his daddy and ran towards him with a joyful cry. They all got in the car and went to Grandma's house. It was her anniversary today. We also had to buy flowers. 10 red roses, please, Julia said to the salesman. The three of them, holding hands, walked down the cemetery avenue. Today was Julia's mother's 60th birthday. Jonathan was carrying flowers. Standing at her mother's grave and looking at her image, Julia thought. Where does the strength come from women like this, whose fragile shoulders can withstand absolutely anything? Julia and Kyle cried as they held their son Jonathan, who was looking at the image of his grandmother with his eyebrows pulled together. Julia and Kyle had decided not to tell their son anything about how he had come into the world. But the thought of it kept Julia's mind busy. A few more years passed. Jonathan was now 10 years old. He grew up an inquisitive, kind and sympathetic boy. He loved his grandmother Linda, whom his mother and father often remembered fondly. One day Jonathan found an old photo album in the attic and was surprised to find pictures of a pregnant Linda. Next to her in the pictures was his mom. The boy ran to Julia and asked, "Mom, why was Grandma Linda pregnant? She didn't have any other children besides you, did she? Or did she?" Julia realized it was time to tell her son the truth about his birth. Barely holding back tears, she told him the whole story. About how much she and Daddy had dreamed of having a baby. About the illness that made it impossible for her to carry and give birth on her own. And how Grandma Linda, out of her love for them, had made it possible for them to become parents. Jonathan listened to his mother with bated breath. He had no idea of such an amazing, almost fairy tale story of his birth. Tears covered his eyes. He was proud of his grandmother and was eternally grateful to her. He also realized that he was very lucky to have a mother and father who loved him so much. After this conversation, Jonathan visited his grandmother's grave with his parents even more often. He would bring her flowers and play Linda's favorite songs. In the evenings he would make a wish while looking at a bright star. He believed his grandmother could hear him and would always protect his family. After a few more years, Jonathan graduated from high school and entered medical school. He decided to become a doctor so he could help couples like his parents fulfill their dream of having a child. And when Jonathan got married, he had a daughter, Linda. Julia and Kyle admired their granddaughter and thought that their mom and Grandma Linda must be very proud of them watching their lives from heaven.